Every time China comes up with something, it's usually labeled as, oh, they're cheating, they stole this.
We're at a point in AI engineering where having decades of experience is as much of a hindrance as it is an advantage.
DeepSeek AI from a Chinese company should be a wake-up call for our industries that we need to be laser focused on competing to win.
DeepSeek, what made them succeed and what happens next to a team of unfathomable geniuses? Kevin Xu of the Interconnected Newsletter and Interconnected Capital, a long-only hedge fund, joins us to discuss. Kevin previously worked at GitHub for a while and worked in press in the Obama administration. Kevin, congratulations on fatherhood and welcome to ChinaTalk.
Thank you so much, Jordan. Thank you for having me back and put up with my sleep deprivation.
Awesome. All right. Kevin, what makes DeepSeek great?
My one-liner description of DeepSeek for anyone who's still catching up is that DeepSeek's newest model is very capable, very affordable, and very open sourced. And I will also add one more, which is that DeepSeek as a company or a startup, or I will actually call them more of a university-like AI research lab, is also very idiosyncratic. And the reason why I say they're idiosyncratic is one, what they have accomplished and how they're set up does not represent the norm of how most Chinese tech companies or most US companies or really most any big tech companies around the world are set up. And this comes out in three different dimensions that I wrote about in my newsletter right after New Year, actually, right after reading the V3 technical paper, which is that one, the lab, the DeepSeek, the lab, has no pressure to commercialize whatsoever. Yes, they have an API that charges some money. It's probably at cost or a little bit above cost just to recoup the everything they put into training the model. And they are not OpenAI. They have no revenue expectation. They probably don't have a sales team. They probably never will have a sales team. And that has given the entire team a lot of freedom to quickly iterate and improve their model based on the latest, greatest open research. And that goes into a second idiosyncratic advantage, which is that they run their own data center. They've been actually running their own data center since probably 2019. So before ChatGPT, before expert control. And this setup is very kind of quintessential to their root as a quant fund, which is all quant funds probably run their own on-prem data centers so they can maximize the speed, the efficiency of the trading algorithm with the hardware that they have purchased to get the most return for their LPs or for their fund. And that level of kind of hardware to software expertise from running your own data center is, I think, what bled into a lot of the kind of the mind-blowing innovation or discovery or a new paradigm that all the hyperbolic commentators have been shouting out the last few days or so, which is that there is a ton of very important software to hardware optimization on the network bandwidth, traffic, balance loading. I read recently that I think in the R1 paper, the engineers are literally going a layer below Cuda to fiddle with the assembly language layer to control the different parts of the GPUs that they have to squeeze the most juice out of it in order to provide a model, again, that is very capable, but also very affordable. And because they have no commercial goal or strategy or pressure, they are very willing to open source probably as much knowledge as they feel like. And I think they're probably, from all dimensions, the most open source model we have in the market to date. And I think all that makes DeepSeek both very impressive, very interesting, but also very kind of an N of one example of what is happening in AI that I think most people should pause before they extrapolate a larger pattern out of what DeepSeek has done.
Sure. Yeah. I'd like to talk a little bit about the sort of hiring practices and labor design. And this is building off a piece we just ran on the ChinaTalk newsletter from J.S. Tana, a PhD candidate at MIT who used to work in the cloud industry. So first, we have a very young CEO, right, who is kind of doing this like out of the goodness of his heart, curiosity, like super long run vision about how this is going to pay off. Parallel number one to OpenAI. I remember Sam Altman in 2019, a journalist asked him, how are you guys going to make money? He's like, I have no idea. Like, we'll figure it out at some point. Parallel number two to OpenAI, super small. So OpenAI, again, in this sort of pre-ChatGPT era, was in the hundreds. I think in 2020, it had literally 150 people, which is the same number of engineers that DeepSeek currently runs off. Number three, a bias towards young and truly exceptional talent that they're kind of willing to pay as much as they need to get, outbidding the likes of ByteDance and Tencent and Alibaba and so on. There are all these kind of like lures of the OpenAI era where, you know, you had a 25-year-old intern or a 26-year-old hire basically coming up with key fundamental innovations that end up unlocking GPT-3 and ChatGPT. We're at a point in AI engineering where having decades of experience is as much of a hindrance as it is an advantage in really trying to push the frontier of knowledge. A quote from Liang, the CEO, "We need people who are extremely passionate about technology, not people who are used to using experience to find answers. Real innovation often comes from people who don't have baggage." A headhunter said they look for people with 3 to 5 years of work experience at most, and any more than 8, and you're just a pass. Generally, you hear stories about the Chinese technology media, about the Chinese tech ecosystem, you know, not hiring anyone under 30 or not hiring anyone under 40, not because like they aren't experienced and can't do the job, but like because they, you know, can't work 100 hours a week and have kids and, you know, will like you know, have a heart attack if you push them too hard or whatever. This is really different, right? And the other thing that they're doing, no KPIs. Like no hard organizational structure, no Simon, no bake-offs between different teams competing to, you know, not collaborating, but competing to work against each other. So like that whole energy and ethos is, as you said, Kevin, much more like a happy academic lab of like all these young engineers just like super psyched to create the future, as opposed to presumably what's happening at Tencent and Alibaba and DeepSeek and even, you know, Google to that extent, is like there is this intense sort of outside pressure to prove a return on investment in model making, which like may not necessarily be the best way to deliver breakthrough innovations the way AI is set up today.
I think there are bunch of different ways we can break down this unique cultural or like organizational structure, right? And big shout out to JS10 for a really great piece that I find myself just like nodding along as I'm reading it because it's very spot on. But I think it's important to understand how DeepSeek could pull this off, right? One, coming back to what I said about a no commercial strategy, it happens to be able to benefit from a quant fund that works right next door, right? Who can basically fund whatever it needs to fund so far, at least, to do what it has to do, right? And I think second, its approach to talent, basically, if I can summarize what you said, Jordan, is that it minimizes politics and maximizes potential, right? And what that means is that when you're in a world like AI, like, you know, AGI development, where none of us really know how to get there. We all have inklings. You know, they reference OpenAI. They look at what Llama's doing. They probably look at what some of the other Chinese labs are doing. And they also have like kind of like hunches, I would say, of their own. It's a killer to progress if you have a hunch in the middle of the night and then you have to wait 2 weeks to get your GPUs before you can validate that hunches. That, based on my observation, does not exist in DeepSeek, right? So one, you have to minimize the organizational structure so you can get the resource you need almost immediately to validate these experimentation needs. And two, you have to have kind of these like young talent that does not have the baggage of experience or baggage of prestige or baggage of previous accomplishment to be willing to just like try random ideas that may or may not succeed, but there's no ramification to failure, right? And I think Sam gave a interview to Bloomberg. There was a much longer one right around the New Year's, return of the New Year, where he again reminisced about that era of OpenAI, where when they were trying to hire to staff up OpenAI back in like 2016 or something, one, they wanted to maybe optimize for the younger talent. Two, they actually could not get experienced talent to come work for them because building AGI at the time in Silicon Valley was actually a bit of a taboo. It was almost like this thing that people don't want to be associated with. They rather work on something more utilitarian, like self-driving or, SaaS or like your kind of like traditional machine learning application or whatever, right? And I think DeepSeek has kind of replicated that, maybe intentionally, maybe not, but in a way that is completely unencumbered from commercial need. And it's not like Liang did not try to raise venture capital. And I think this goes into another nuance of the current state of Chinese VC, which is that there's zero appetite for the kind of idealistic, a vision or dream that DeepSeek is kind of designed to pursue. And so he couldn't raise any money, even though he tried. And I was like, well, we got the people, we got some GPUs here, that just gives it a shot. It doesn't stop me from kind of pursuing this thing. And now we kind of see the fruit of that labor. And you can contrast that with a lot of these other more kind of well-known or well-funded AI labs in China, whether it's Zhipu or, like Moonshot, or obviously all the big models coming out of Alibaba and Baidu and Tencent, which is that, of course, they have either their internal ROI or commercialization goals to be accountable to, or they have either state-backed or financial VCs from China to be accountable to at some point. And the way you build those companies actually is you have to hire well-known AI quantities to attract talent, to also kind of convince investors to give you money, which again, is something that DeepSeek just did not need to do. Maybe it wanted to do at a point in time, but clearly they've given up on that path and it served them very well.
What's interesting is the contrast between this playbook and other sort of big Chinese industrial policy efforts. I think semiconductors is probably the most obvious, right? Where SMIC, famously founded by former TSMC engineers,
right.
CXMT, same deal. Huawei poached enormous amount of talent from Taiwan and South Korea in order to get its chip design and engineering up to snuff. And there's something really sort of special and magical about AI today, where the decades of experience, for whatever reason, just happens to be more of a detriment than it is helpful. And, we are living in this incredible sort of technological paradigm shift where people are discovering all these new like laws and principles and algorithms every day, and having the muscle memory of dozens of years of doing this back in a prior paradigm, for whatever reason, is like actually more harm than it is health, which is just the coolest thing, I think.
Yeah. And if I can add on that for a little bit, I think there are a lot of folks who are trying to maybe fit what DeepSeek has done into some broader AI strategy out of China, and also another sort of block into the industrial policy conversation, right, that Jordan, you're talking about. I think what SMIC has done makes total sense because qualitatively, they're trying to catch up to something that's known, right? Which is semiconductor manufacturing, right? Like, TSMC has been way ahead of anything in China for a very long time. Samsung has been ahead. And, so what they do, they poach the one guy, Liang Mengsong, who was kind of the former CTO-ish. Well, he didn't get the CTO job. He wanted to get a CTO job at TSMC, didn't get the job, had this big fight with TSMC, went to Samsung, helped Samsung catch up to TSMC, and then try to play the same role with SMIC to help SMIC catch up to Samsung and TSMC. What that means is that all you need to do is to get that one or two people who already knows how this is done to get you to do something that already exists as quickly as possible, right? And that means getting the experienced person, having their halo effect, get you the talent and the equipment, and then off you go with, state subsidies and whatnot. That is qualitatively different from AI research or AGI development or anything that we're doing in AI, which is that we're all just like maybe 6 months to 9 months ahead of each other into the unknown is clearly where we are right now. Therefore, none of the halo effect of experience well, I shouldn't say none of them matters, but it matters so much less than other much more well-established areas of industry and technology, like chip manufacturing, for example.
Totally. So Liang, clearly, at least, given his interviews, the most AGI pilled of all of the Chinese AI lab leaders, as well, the most open source pilled, it seemed. So Kevin, before launching your fund, you worked at GitHub for a long time and had a fair amount of interaction with the kind of global open source community, as well as the community in China. Let's do a little 101 on it and how you see their energy kind of baked into the team and the motivation at DeepSeek.
I'll explain this in two parts. One is open source itself, which at the very kind of basic level is this way to develop and build technology in the open, and also be willing to let anyone kind of like find, download, share, change the code that you build in the open, with almost the assumption that code itself, the actual source code and everything, has very little value. In and of itself. There's no need to keep them behind a license or some kind of closed door situation. You build in the open. That's the best way you build technology. That's been a sort of a 40+ year movement, if you will. And that movement has really taken root in China in the mid 2000s, I would say. So relatively early, the Linux Foundation, which is sort of the nonprofit steward of the Linux software, which is the largest open source operating system in the world, has been doing events and hosting conferences in China in the mid-20s, right? The mid-2000s. And if you think about Liang's personal history, that is about the time when he started going to college. He was probably a pretty star, high school student, very technically given. And there is actually a generation of Chinese entrepreneurs around that age group, I would say like late 30s now, early 40s, who are very much open source enthusiasts, in the sense that they think this is one of the best things that ever happened to their own kind of discovery or self-development. And now that they've come of age, they're very pro open source in its benefit, in its kind of positive sum elements. And I think, again, coming back to the idiosyncrasies of DeepSeek, Liang could also pull it off because he has a fund that could fund this research project with no need to directly commercialize the open source model, which is very different if you kind of compare and contrast that to other competitors. And the one thing I will also share from a cultural perspective, I think is very, very important for people to understand, is that inside the Chinese open source community, there's this thing that I will loosely describe as like open source like zeal or open source calling. The term is called like 开源情怀, right? And what that really manifests itself is that there's this very strong corp of engineers in China who just loves open source. And they used to use mostly Western open source software to, do their work, to help maybe their company catch up, to learn about technology more and more. Another thing that open source is good for is basically learning about how technology works. And I think maybe 6-7 years ago, there's a turning point where a lot of these engineers, and I will probably put Liang in that category too, where they also want to produce open source now. They want to contribute. They want to make their own open source project and then have the world use it. And they get incredibly excited when any sort of Western firm, especially like a Silicon Valley firm with any kind of brand recognition, uses their database, their kind of like, microservices sidecar or whatever random kind of little package in the infrastructure of the cloud. And that is where a lot of open source really happens before AGI or AI development. And they will put on free, support. They will fix your bug in the middle of the night. They will answer all your questions in these forums. And for them, it's really much a source of validation and approval. And implicit in that is the fact that they understand how little respect Chinese engineering gets, Chinese technology gets. Every time China comes up with something, it's usually labeled as, oh, they're cheating, they stole this, and so on and so forth. And in a sense, it's a bit nationalistic. It's also a bit of just engineering pride in the sense that they want to prove to the world that their open source stuff can be used and loved by a Western firm too. And they could care less if they pay them any money. They want that validation more than anything else. And I think I see a lot of that 开源情怀, if you will, from what DeepSeek is doing. and hopefully continue to do because it's an open question, if they can continue to open source in perpetuity.
All right, Kevin, I'm going to hit you with another one. 崇洋媚外. There is this really interesting dichotomy. If you read closely Liang's two extensive interviews that he gave to Censor Liuke. The first one in 2023 was very much in that open source zealing ethos of like, I'm doing this thing. There's no profit motive. It's going to be good for humanity. It's kind of crazy, but like, just look how much we're going to give to the world through our models and algorithms. Then you get to this interview, I think it was July 2024, where the focus is much more on showing the world and showing Chinese engineers that they can do, I think it's 核心, like
core innovation capability, right?
Yeah, like 核心创造 or something, like hardcore innovation that China sort of has, as we talked about at the beginning of this podcast. Like Chinese tech firms have this chip on their shoulder, poor organizational structure, poor incentives, and they think that all they can do is kind of commercialize Western technology, like do like dumb consumer software stuff, not really push the frontier of innovation from a software perspective. And he's like, look, we're doing this and it's going to be awesome. And, a few weeks ago, you have the creator of Black Myth, Wukong, the sort of like nationalist game studio, talking about DeepSeek's model as if it was a guoyun, like something that shapes the national destiny. And I think this tension between the open source global, surplus good that AI can bring and which country is going to do it first and make the most out of it is really going to define the future of DeepSeek and what the future of DeepSeek and the future, I guess, of AI in general, of where the world ends up falling down on that divide.
Yeah, I think the tension there is very palpable. I don't think they're irreconcilable, but I do think there is a tension there, right? Because open source, as I described, kind of by definition is borderless. It's very much, code speaks for itself, right? And anyone can leverage it, use it. It's sort of this public good, which has its own drawback as well. If you go to any of these, open source conferences, which I've been to a lot of them up and down the stack, engineers all speak variants of English in different accents from around the world, but their community is not defined by their nationality. It's defined by, are you a C++ guy or a Rust person? Are you like are you like a Kubernetes person or are you like an OpenStack person? These are sort of just like different camps of technology in open source that kind of divide themselves into their own little tribe, if you will. And that is completely counter to national identity as a whole. But when you come to the sort of the uniqueness of the Chinese engineering or the Chinese communists, the Chinese open source community, there is this nationalistic either pride and or chip on their shoulder that they want to prove to the world that Chinese open source technology, which by definition goes into just Chinese technology as a general matter, is good enough for the world to use. And we love it if you use it. At least at this point, there's no expectation for the world to pay them back, right, for this contribution. And that also goes into, again, the idiosyncratic nature of DeepSeek's team, which is, based on all estimates, entirely folks trained and studied in Chinese universities. Some of them might have done stints in foreign companies, but none of them for very long. None of them have like long tenures at Google in Silicon Valley or Meta before kind of getting poached back to, work on stuff back in China. And that is, again, a very unique identity. And it almost feels like a recruiting pitch. At least every time I see CEO do, any kind of interview, which Liang gives very few, and we can talk about why that's the case as well. There's always a recruiting element in there, right? He wants to attract the best and the brightest because he does have to fight against all the other big shops who probably do offer more money than DeepSeek can really kind of go head to head on when it comes to offer matching. And really what DeepSeek can provide is a kind of freedom to explore, maybe this open source pride that's very attractive to a lot of engineers. I definitely know engineers who will work for less in terms of salary if the company they work for is much more open to sharing and more kind of like open source friendly, right?
Yeah.
And then you take that into different directions as far as like how he's built the lab, and all that makes a lot of sense. But the tension is certainly there.
Yeah, well, I mean, on the salary thing, like it's easier to literally pay top dollar if you're paying top dollar to 25-year-olds, not 40-year-olds, right? So actually the reporting kind of works the other way, where folks say that they actually pay the most. But it's much easier to pay the most when it's junior talent, which is less proven, versus like, you know, the Stanford PhD who spent 10 years at Meta that like everyone and their mother is bidding on. But
right, that's
anyways,
right. I think it's more like they're willing to pay high dollar to take a chance on younger, unproven talent, right?
Yeah.
Which a lot of bigger shops either don't, or they get shoved into the system and they don't really care about them.
So let's talk about the future for DeepSeek. Continuing our OpenAI analogy. OpenAI, of course, like, you know, they didn't have a hedge fund attached to them, but they just had donations from like Elon Musk and Sam Altman and whatever.
They're both nonprofit in a sense.
Yeah. But at a certain point, right, like they realized that in order to both scale their product and scale their research, they needed to start shacking up with a hyperscaler who turned out to be Microsoft. And I guess now it's Oracle and, you know, the Dubai money or whatever. How do you think about the different ways that this plays out for DeepSeek from a corporate organization perspective once they've just experienced this moment?
I think my best guess right now is that DeepSeek has a good chance of just staying who it is for at least another year or two. And that in AI is probably eternity. And the reason I say that is, one, it's just it's very well set up to do what it does, like accidentally, right? Like, I don't know if like Liang ever thought about doing DeepSeek when he started a hedge fund. But being a quant hedge fund, which is very secretive. And this is another thing that I learned recently about, Liang, is that he worships Jim Simons, which is the founder of Renaissance Technology, which is one of the most successful quant hedge fund and also the most secretive quant hedge fund to have ever existed in that world. And he actually wrote the Chinese kind of blurb or forward to the definitive biography on Jim Simons a few years ago. It's this book called The Man Who Stopped the Market by Gregory Zuckerman of Wall Street Journal, which is a fantastic read if you're into just like, you know, financial history and like learning about these people. Like Liang worships that guy, right? Which also explains a lot of his media shyness. He's kind of like, you know, I don't really want to like give interviews. That's very Jim Simons of him. And as long as his hedge fund keeps humming along, he could do this for a pretty long time, right? And as far as I know, they don't even have a PR department. They don't have any of this like sort of like big company apparatus. They're just going to keep doing what they're doing. Now, what I think could actually maybe counterintuitively change this, if for some reason export control from the United States gets loosened because of their development, which is a lot of the silly chatter that I know you push back on and others have pushed back on, that, you know, export control doesn't work because of DeepSeek, therefore we should like do away with it. Because why I say it is that NVIDIA product becomes more accessible again. They, being DeepSeek and every other Chinese firm, will line up outside the door to get them. And in that sense, they actually will need a lot more money very quickly to get them. And does that mean they have to either shack up with a hyperscaler or take outside funding very quickly to be able to afford that? Could very much change the dynamic of how DeepSeek is set up in a way that if you give DeepSeek, you know, $100 billion tomorrow to build AI infrastructure, there is actually not a whole lot of places you can deploy immediately, partially, again, because of export control.
Even if export controls don't change or they get tighter, there are still lots of, we have we have a story coming out in a few days about China's weird chip surplus, where apparently, you know, there's actually a ton of chips sort of floating around. They're like random local governments have them. You know, ByteDance and Huawei and Alibaba and Tencent, like these guys are no slouches. And the sort of opportunity, you know, not only to scale inference, but also just to scale their experiments. If DeepSeek does, I mean, does get a partnership is really remarkable. I mean, I can only imagine the conversations going on in the hyperscalers who have their own AI labs. There's this famous quote from Satya Nadella after ChatGPT dropped, where he brings Peter Lee, who ran Microsoft Research, into the office and goes and interrupts him in the middle of his presentation. Was like, OpenAI built this with 250 people. Why do we have Microsoft Research at all? Yeah. I'm sure there are. I'm sure there is leadership at the hyperscalers who are looking at their teams and being like, screw this. We should just sign some partnership like Microsoft did with OpenAI, because this is the golden goose. These guys are just, these guys and girls are just better than what we have. So if someone comes knocking on Liang's door and says, look, like, export controls or not, we can give you 10x the compute budget you have now. Like, how does that sound?
That's a
it's
very
a really
interesting
offer,
scenario,
right?
And I will put another company on people's roadmap, on people's radar from like a AI monitoring perspective on the Chinese side, which is Xiaomi. From what I understand, one of the key authors of the DeepSeek V3 development and paper, I think he might have been either CTO or very high up in engineering kind of ladder, to the extent that they have any ladder at DeepSeek. He got poached to Xiaomi very recently to lead their AI division. And Xiaomi has been making a lot of noise from we're going to do more with AI. We're going all in on AI. We have all these EVs that are really good. We're going to do self-driving, all that sort of good stuff. We already have devices everywhere, right? So they have a lot of channel to diffuse Gen AI. That's another company that does not get talked about very frequently when we talk about Chinese AI. But I think, to your point, Jordan, it will be a very interesting many forks in the road for DeepSeek. Then again, I don't think they anticipated it. And totally. I know there's a lot of machination about, wow, is this DeepSeek release, showing up Trump's inauguration be on the same day, or, push back against this, or to destroy NVIDIA because their quantum has an NVIDIA short position, which is all a bunch of like conspiracy theory mumbo jumbo that's really fun to read, to be honest. But I think, I hope people don't take them too seriously, because if you look at the timeline of the most important releases that got us to talk about DeepSeek in the first place, DeepSeek V3, the base large language model, not the reasoning model, was released, I think, the day after Christmas. And if you as a company want to maximize your press impact in the Western world, you've probably chosen the worst time to release anything, and your PR person or your PR firm should be fired immediately, right? So that's point number one. And point number two, when it comes to R1's release, which happens to be, on Trump's inauguration day, I think, or close to that day, again, if you want to maximize your impact, no one in the West is paying attention to anything that isn't about President Trump being the president. And again, it only took a week for us to really grapple what R1 really meant after it was released. And if anything, I think the Stargate announcement of the $500 billion, which caught a lot of people in the AI world by surprise in a fairly, I would say, consensus skeptical way, like, do we really need to do this, or does Southside really have the money to do this? All the R1 paper was just sitting there, right? And we're like, oh wait, there's this other thing that we can use that supposedly costs so much less to train, and we don't have to talk about the numbers. I think it's obviously a little bit cherry picked, right? But the whole point is that Stargate probably elevated DeepSeek in a way that DeepSeek never thought it could elevate on its own. And really, the only forcing function I can think of that really matters in terms of the DeepSeek release schedule is Chinese Lunar New Year.
Chinese New Year.
Which is where we're sitting here right now, right? For every single Chinese company, just like how every single American company want to get done with their shipping before Christmas, they want to get done with their shipping before Chinese Lunar New Year so they can go off and, enjoy their holidays and come back and go for another year of hustling.
Yeah, I was just thinking about other sort of cultural changes about to hit them. It was interesting because the OpenAI attrition, right? There was all this Sam Altman skepticism. People didn't believe him. They thought he was a liar or whatever. And they had that moment in December 2023 where you had this sort of false unity, I guess, and then all of these, their people who used to be 25 years old, now turned into their early 30s, and we're like, all right, we're kind of done with this place and done with this guy.
Right.
You had a lot of senior research turnover over the past year at OpenAI, and DeepSeek's at the beginning of that cycle, right? And not to say that Liang, has any integrity issues or whatever, but just the sheer amount of money that the other AI labs and but like, things are going to change, I think, and perhaps not for the better given all this attention. Let's talk about the political angle. So again, right before Chinese New Year, Liang gets a little glow up with Li Qiang, sitting down as the only AI representative in this work report, like preview or what have you. Now that the eye of Sauron is turning towards open source AI in China, what do you think that means for the firm and for open source AI in general?
I mean, I honestly have no idea. I think the Li Qiang meeting was very interesting to observe. First of all, just, to give people some context, I think the setting was to your, as you mentioned, a work report where I think they regularly do these sort of, the top leader learn from the industry leader setup, right? Where like, what is happening? What you're doing, I guess maybe like in the most benign sense, how can the government help, right? And I think the most reliable leak from the meeting was that Liang, I think predictably, told the country's leader that we need more chips. We're hardware constrained. This export control really sucks, and it will be great if we have more chips. And and all the other participants, they're not from tech, right? They're from like all over different industries like sports and like science. There will feel like robotics people, I think, that actually was overrepresented in the setting. And Liang is probably like the only like AGI model builder. But the fact that, he is now on the country's top leaders' radar is significant. To what extent is this significant? I honestly have no idea. I just know that it is significant. And to what extent does this become part of some sort of a negotiation between President Trump and President Xi at some point in part of their conversation? If the last call that Trump had with Xi mentioned TikTok, will the next call they have mentioned DeepSeek? I think that's a very interesting thing for us to kind of, again, monitor. But there is, there's a chance that the state could do a little too much to mess with DeepSeek's little world that is working really, really well, or it could let it be. And frankly, I have no idea how this thing is going to turn out.
Yeah. So before we get to the US angle, let's just do things on the ledger of like the helpful versus harmful things. More chips. I think DeepSeek, if they want, they can get more chips by our, pairing with the hyperscaler stuff. And probably that's way less headache than trying to like hang out with the Beijing municipal cloud or whatever, whose like interconnects are probably already eaten away by rats or something. Do they need tax incentives? No. Do they need R&D credits? Like, not really. Annoying things that could happen, golden shares, right? Forcing the team to like hang out in Yan'an for 10 days to like, see the caves and like be more red. Party cells, like party meetings. Again, a little annoying, but like not the most annoying. It's just like a thing you kind of got to deal with. The bigger question to me is like the long-term question I have of if and when open source models get too powerful for comfort, what the Chinese government thinks about its firms really pushing the frontier there. Because, right now these models are fun. They're fine. You can use them to write poetry. You can use them to like maybe book a restaurant for you. But you can't just by having a DeepSeek model on your laptop hack your city's hospital system or read police reports or what have you. And we're on the trajectory where that sort of thing might happen. And my base case is that once the models get more powerful, you're going to start to see more controls on what is and isn't allowed to be released and told to the world. And now that folks on the central committee are going to be following this to a closer degree than they were before, this open versus closed source dynamic with AI software. I don't know. It just I see downside scenarios for a company that really prides itself on putting everything it does out into the public.
Yeah, there's definitely a lot of downside scenarios. If there's one thing I could provide that is kind of layer open source that we were talking about into the government perspective on open source, at least so far as I've seen it from whatever the Chinese government releases, is that they've been interestingly very pro open source so far in the way they project how they think about technology abroad, almost as a source of soft power, whether knowingly or not. I think the Ministry of Industry and Information Technology, MIT, released part of their like 5 or 4 year report that they want to see, 2 to 3 very well-known, recognized Chinese open source projects by the year of 2025. And I think if they were to do the progress report or the report card on that plan today, DeepSeek will be on it. And that will be a great KPI moment for everybody in that ministry, right? Whether they had a role to play in it is, of course, a different story. And even more recently, I think Foreign Minister Wang Yi, when he was in the UN, when he was doing UNGA, he talked about open source AI actually being something that China wants to use as a way to support the global south and all that sort of stuff to help them develop their AI, at least from the outside perspective. They're quote unquote very open source friendly from a projection perspective. How does that work when one of your labs is at the frontier or close to the frontier or very competitive? Is a different situation. But I do think those are just a few data points that at least folks should think about, keep in mind as we think about these sort of like distribution of outcomes, right, for DeepSeek from like the worst to the best. And another thing that if any Chinese, I guess, government leaders listening to this and want to have like helpful advice being put into their ears, probably a useful thing is actually to unlock data that's very higher quality to train. I think there's always going to be a data problem for as far as I can see. I know reinforcement learning has been kind of put on the map again because of R1's progress. So maybe, kind of like synthetic data, model training each other can get us a lot farther. But there's always more data than can be unlocked if they're quality. And the government does have kind of a lot of data, if you will.
I want every ding to be like fully into the AGI. I think we need that like ancient Shang dynasty wisdom for our future AI overlords. So part of the big freak out, right? Maybe I'll play this. I'm going to play this clip from Mark Zuckerberg on Joe Rogan.
If there's going to be an open source model that everyone uses, like we should want it to be an American model, right? It's like there's this great Chinese model that just came out, this company DeepSeek. They're doing really good work. It's a very advanced model. And if you ask it for any negative opinions about Xi Jinping, it will not give you anything. If you ask it if Tiananmen Square happened, it will deny it.
My contention to you, Kevin, like this seems kind of overblown. Like the percentage of global queries that are going to be used for whatever model you use for your company's API that ask about Tiananmen or Xi Jinping thought or Xinjiang or whatever are basically zero. How would you conceptualize what companies, and I guess countries more broadly, gain and lose from their model being the open source one that the world thinks is the coolest and wants to build on?
Yeah, I think what Zuck said was very interesting. I actually wrote a post on my Interconnected newsletter about this too, as far as like whether Zuck was right or not. I think Zuckerberg, for what it's worth, has been part of his core strategic message for a few years now. This is not a recent thing, is the she or me argument, which is that, because Facebook has been, or Meta has been under US regulatory pressure for many, many, many years. And one of his more effective argument is that you can, drive me down, but the world will just use TikTok, which they do, or the world will just use less Instagram, and then that's actually bad for U.S. competitiveness, right? So this is sort of a consistent string of that argument, but it's just in the context of AI. I think when it comes to censorship in the model, and I did a little bit of tests on this, and I need to update my post, which is that if it's an open source model, it really depends on where you run it, not whether the model itself is censored or not. I'm fairly confident in saying that every single model, at least coming out of DeepSeek, and the open source ones from Alibaba probably as well, are trained from the world's internet knowledge to begin with as a starting point. And then different things get fine-tuned out or fine-tuned in the post-training process, right? And if you use some of those models on your own laptop, you just download it because it's open source. I use Olama. The behavior is very different than if you were to use it as a chatbot on their officially hosted website on like, deepseek.ai or something, because the censoring or the business logic that prevents your chatbot from saying things that could get you in trouble really happens more in the cloud layer than the models themselves, though some of that happens in the model as well. And there's a third element to this too, is that if you put DeepSeek on a third-party, non-sort of official DeepSeek hosting environment, it also behaves differently, which is why now Perplexity, which is like a leading, AI search startup that's really hot, is really killing it with their DeepSeek deployment to get more user, because they're deploying it on their own US cloud server, promising no censorship, and then can still leverage their best open source model, right now being DeepSeek R1. Now, what does that mean for kind of the broader global AI diffusion conversation? I think it's probably not a huge number of people who would ask a chatbot about Tiananmen or other like very obviously politically kind of taboo topic in China. And to the extent that they do, if they're not getting the information they should, then that is like a bit of a problem. But right now, most of these open source models, where they really shine is in the business adoption setting, right? Where if you're like a large company, you want to use AI to summarize your cost center scripts, to help your salesperson be more efficient, to summarize your internal knowledge base, OpenAI APIs are just way too expensive, probably. And if you have this super affordable thing that you can deploy on a third-party cloud, right now it's actually on Azure already. That's a very interesting late-breaking development that Azure has entirely embraced DeepSeek. It's now one of their first-party model that you can just click and use on Azure. DeepSeek, right?
Dude,
because they're like, wow, people
such
want
a troll. That's amazing.
I mean, it's incredible. And there's like, hey, that's the most pragmatic CEO. That's a shareholder-friendly CEO right there. It's like, well, the people want DeepSeek. Let's put them on Azure. Right? Why is Microsoft not worried about the quote-unquote censor risk characteristic of DeepSeek or any Chinese open source model? Is because you really don't have that effect if you put them or serve them up in the right cloud setting and for the right business use case, because most businesses just want to get this AI thing going, hopefully, but also with a cost structure that actually makes sense economically. And let's be honest, no one wants a $200 per month pro subscription account. That does not last for very long. People want a lot cheaper AI. And that is, again, what open source in general brings to the industry. And it's actually a very big validation point, in my opinion, of Meta's open source strategy for a very long time, is them pushing out Llama and not give a damn about profit because, again, they don't need Llama to make any money for them, and really kind of erode this closed source model moat that OpenAI and to a large extent Anthropic as well has been erecting to protect themselves. And that is sort of the big question going forward, how long that could really last.
All right. So another argument beyond the this is going to spread Xi Jinping thought. There's also the slightly more nuanced one of DeepSeek can now run on Ascend 910s, Huawei's AI chip. And the argument goes that look, if people standardize on DeepSeek and DeepSeek really works at a super low level to partner with Huawei to make their chips actually this is a way to make Huawei chips, which are currently not all that competitive with NVIDIA's, a much more exciting buying prospect for both domestically in China and for global cloud providers who now, thanks to the AI diffusion rule, are going to have a harder time getting Western chips to kind of port over in a, I guess, analogous way to how Huawei was able to outcompete Ericsson and Nokia.
Yeah, I think beyond the hardware, I would say from a U.S. competitiveness perspective, the one thing that should really concern people as far as the Huawei ecosystem benefiting from this is the ability that DeepSeek engineers has kind of gone below Cuda to really maximize the crap out of their NVIDIA GPU. Because I think that is a level of kind of low-level engineering that could potentially help Huawei's software ecosystem. Because I think that is the bigger struggle for more people to adopt, anything that's not NVIDIA, is that Cuda is so dominant. And I know Huawei's been trying to kind of promote their own equivalent of Cuda. They work very closely with PyTorch, which is the open source kind of like training framework, right? That is like kind of equivalent to Cuda in a way. But to really mold that ecosystem and push developers away from Cuda, not necessarily an NVIDIA GPU. And if there is a lot more kind of sharing between how DeepSeek has been able to optimize that in a way that makes the software layer of the Ascend series much more competitive, and then I think there could be a bit more erosion of the CUDA moat that by extension is sort of the American moat in a way that I don't think a lot of people still grok, which because that level of kind of like messiness and a low level engineering is so hard to do and so few places can really do them really, really well. Even if like Ascend, the raw hardware has like better flops and better performance on all sorts of like scales, people still won't use it because of CUDA, probably not to a large extent. But this could really flip the bit, if you will, on that situation. That's another thing. That's a very interesting unknown to tap into where DeepSeek comes in.
I guess here's our transition to export controls, right? Because like Huawei's limitation is on the manufacturing side, and that comes back to their inability to import semiconductor manufacturing equipment, which is why we're in this whole situation in the first place. So maybe now here's the time to play a clip from President Trump.
Today and over the last couple of days, I've been reading about China and some of the companies in China, one in particular, coming up with a faster method of AI and much less expensive method. And that's good because you don't have to spend this much money. I view that as a positive, as an asset. So I really think if it's fact and if it's true, and nobody really knows if it is, but I view that as a positive because you'll be doing that too. So you won't be spending as much and you'll get the same result, hopefully. The release of DeepSeek AI from a Chinese company should be a wake-up call for our industries that we need to be laser focused on competing to win, because we have the greatest scientists in the world. Even Chinese leadership told me that. They said, you have the most brilliant scientists in the world in Seattle and various places. But Silicon Valley, they said, there's nobody like those people. This is very unusual when you hear a DeepSeek, when you hear somebody come up with something. We always have the ideas. We're always first. So I would say that's a positive. That could be very much a positive development. So instead of spending billions and billions, you'll spend less and you'll come up with, hopefully, the same solution. Under the Trump administration, we're going to unleash our tech companies and we're going to dominate the future like never before.
Who's writing this? Whoever wrote this, I am sure is a ChinaTalk listener. Please DM me. We should probably chat. Anyway,
I feel like they have to be. They have to be, because I was very surprised and mildly impressed by how quickly DeepSeek made it into President Trump's speech to a group of mostly, I think, Republican congressional leaders. This was a very U.S. domestic event, right? He was talking to the Republican conference about his legislative agenda, tax cuts, deporting illegal immigrants, what have you. And then he just let DeepSeek in there on the day, I believe, of the big market crash that was very much DeepSeek triggered. And what he said at the time, at least, was very complimentary. It was almost like a tough love, message. Be like, the U.S. industry, you gotta get your act together. Look at this DeepSeek thing. They're kicking our butt. Chinese. But the Chinese leaders tell us we have the best people, we have the best scientists, so we shouldn't rest on our laurels, etc. I think that messaging has changed a little bit already over time, so we'll see where this really ends up from a policy perspective. But I have to begrudgingly give a little kudos to the speechwriting team of the Trump White House for even working that in so quickly. As a former, comms person myself back in the days in that role, because they're on top of it for what it's worth. How does that translate to export control? Now we've seen kind of rumors of export control even tightening further, right, from the Trump administration.
So let's
let's get into that.
2025 ChinaTalk, we're professionalizing. Rolling another clip. Howard Lutnick had his confirmation hearing just yesterday.
We've got to find a way to back our export controls with tariff model so that we tell China, you think we are your most important trading partner. When we say no, the answer is no. It's a respect thing. They've disrespected us. They've figured out their ways around it. I do not believe that DeepSeek was done all above board. That's nonsense. Okay? They stole things. They broke in. They've taken our IP. It's got to end. And I'm going to be rigorous in our pursuit of restrictions and enforcing those restrictions to keep us in the lead, because we must stay in the lead. I take a very jaundiced view of China. I think they only care about themselves and seek to harm us. And so we need to protect ourselves. We need to drive our innovation, right? And we need to stop helping them. You know, open platforms, Meta's open platform, let DeepSeek rely on it. NVIDIA's chips, which they bought tons of and they found their ways around it, drive their DeepSeek model. It's got to end. If they're going to compete with us, let them compete, but stop using our tools to compete with us. So I'm going to be very strong on that. I'm thrilled to oversee BIS, and I'm thrilled to coordinate and empower BIS with tariffs that will improve the strength. When we say no, the answer's got to be no.
In the first news cycle of this, back when I did my podcast last week with Miles Brundage, there was some concern that this was going to be a sort of turning point in the export control debate, where people, myself included, were already worried about Trump sort of like turning export controls into like a package deal that he'll use to like get them to buy more soybeans or something. And, this is at least an initial, really interesting marker by the Trump administration that no, in fact, this stuff isn't necessarily on the table when it comes to America striking a deal. But I want to take a step back, Kevin, maybe, and ask you more broadly, like, there is something that is really sad about this. I agree with you that what DeepSeek has done and the team that it has is something that's really special. And, people talk about like, what can the US and China collaborate on? And the first thing that people always point to is like, medical collaboration. Like, wouldn't it be great if like we work together to cure cancer or something? And there is going to be so much positive social good that is going to be generated from artificial intelligence. And I think, if the politics were, if the government was different in China than it is today, there would be, that one piece of the Trump administration, of the Trump comment where he's like, this is awesome. Like, everyone's going to save a lot of money. Like, this is going to be cheaper and better for the world. Like, if it was in almost any other country on the planet, that would be the reaction, but it's not. Because of all the reasons we've talked about in the 500 other ChinaTalk episodes, we don't necessarily have to get into right now. But I'm curious for that dimension of like, to what extent, Kevin, you think there is any sort of third path when it comes to sort of U.S.-China relations, strategic competition, and artificial intelligence.
Yeah, it is very interesting that President Trump's comment sounds more like a Silicon Valley investor. And Howard Lutnick, who's supposed to be the Wall Street free market guy, sounds more like a hardcore, DC China export control supporter, which I think you and I are actually on the same page on this one. From a tactical perspective, and I think it's important for people to understand this, from a tactical perspective, export control, for the most part, has worked reasonably well to achieve its goal of keeping, Chinese AI progress from becoming further along. I think, but for export control, Chinese AI labs would have gone much further than where DeepSeek or Alibaba has gone right now. Now, that is a tactical question. The tactics arise from the strategy of small yard, high fence, right? So people kind of conflate strategy with tactics. Small yard, high fence is the why question. Export control is the how question, right? And of course, the how flows from the why. And I think the big question mark right now is, does the Trump administration challenge or change the why of our relationship with China when it comes to AI competition? It's the big kind of open question that will change export control one way or another in its entirety, and it could change the whole ball game. But I do think a lot of folks who have been hyperventilating about export control failing and whatnot kind of misses the difference between what is tactical and what is strategic.
So let's tease out some of those futures. On the one hand, we have Dario Amodei, who's like, look, we got to cut them off from the H20s. We got to squeeze them as much as we can because we're, about to run into the singularity, and we want liberal democracies to be able to decide how that works, not the CCP. Then we have like channeling like VC investor Trump, I guess, like, oh, this is great for the world. Like American companies like put up or shut up. Like you guys need to step up your game. It's not my job to bail you out. And if you lose, like whatever, it's a global good. This is open source. Things will work out. You all get great, AI tutors. What other sort of visions are, can you conjure, Kevin, of how this could potentially play out?
Yeah, I think the Dario's essay is very much worth a read. And what's interesting is that there's sort of the benign humanity benefit path, and then there is the strictly military kind of competition head-to-head path, right? I think one of the justifications that Dario's essay made for the argument that he was trying to convince people of is the military argument that, when China gets to AGI, before the democratic or the Western world does, they will use it to, apply it to military setting, right? But if we come back to the cancer curing setting, I don't think anyone would argue or care that the cancer solution that you got from AGI is a democratic cancer solution or a non-democratic cancer solution. And if there is a third way to parse this very difficult kind of path forward, is can we disaggregate the use cases, basically, right? There are obvious use cases where the nature of it is conflict, right? That's military, that's war. There's no really question about that. And then there's a bunch of other use cases that's, quite frankly, just like business productivity, efficiency, all the enterprise AI stuff that I sort of mentioned, right? And then there's the humanity benefit thing, which is, health. And it's interesting that if you watch the Stargate, press conference in the White House, the way they talk about why this is justified is not military. It's healthcare. That's what Larry Ellison said. It's potentially curing, finding a cure to cancer, which is what Sam Altman said. That is the benign message, at least to justify the $500 billion or whatever billions of dollars of AI investment that they are hoping to have here in the United States. But there is this interesting dichotomy that it's like only the West can find the cure to the cancer first, and then we're going to license it to the rest of the world. Yeah. Situation, right? Which hopefully gets sort of diluted over time, in my personal opinion, when open source is a little bit more widely accepted from a positive sum perspective. But we have to be mindful that AI could be used for conflict as well, right? Or for like nuclear development. I actually want to give Anthropic kudos based on what I know. The way they release their new models is that they actually work with, I think, the U.S. government's Nuclear Review Commission to red team the model to make sure the model doesn't like really accidentally leak out really important and very harmful things related to nuclear power or nuclear weapon making. Not just to probably adversaries, but more importantly, like non-state actors and terrorist organizations. I think that is sort of the middle of the road AI safety lens on this that I think deserves to be talked about a little bit more without kind of preventing the world from getting to the cure to cancer a little bit earlier, if you will, just because of this sort of paradigm of conflict that we can't get ourselves out of.
It's, I think, instructive to read the Dario export control essay in parallel to the one that he wrote in October 2024, which I thought was, really powerful meditation called Machines of Loving Grace, where he actually has this biomedical background and he was able to paint out in like clear detail, like the ways in which medical research is going to be accelerated. But you have that, and on the other hand, you have the missile systems, and you have the have the drone swarms, and all of the nastiness that can come out of it. And I don't know, Kevin. Maybe that is the sort of base case. Is like I think it is probably impossible to stop the PLA from benefiting from AI. They're going to get the chips first. They're going to be able to squeeze all the engineers, squeeze all the secrets out of the best engineers and like impress talent or what have you. And they might not do it efficiently, but like the thing that I think maybe the U.S. and China and the rest of the world can try to minimize is that like crazy leakage into like the one kid who, instead of going crazy and shooting up a school, like goes crazy and releases like a bioweapon that like kills half of humanity or something.
I'm honestly much more concerned with the latter case, like either rogue actor or non-state actor, as opposed to reasonably irrational state actor, like really kind of blowing up things literally for, God knows why, right? And I'm just personally not a very deep military person. Personally, like right now, I'm still like kind of skeptical of like what the latest AI model can really do for making weapons more harmful. I can see that from a cyber attack angle, to be honest. That sounds more plausible to me. But from like a physical weapon angle, it's just hard for me to know, I guess. And even from the United States perspective, DoD, it's been deploying a lot of AI, using a lot of Palantir software and whatever. But one of the big
seems fine. I don't know.
Right. I mean, the biggest benefits actually that I've seen folks talk about is like better, more efficient supply chain management, right? That's like an enterprise AI application. That is not a offensive application. It's to make your back office, your supply chain, which is very complicated in the DoD military setting, much more efficient, which is no different from, IBM wanting to like use AI to like, make the organization leaner or something.
Yeah, I mean, look, the bull case is AI drives scientific advancements, which then can be weaponized, right? There are all these like very knotty technical problems where if you could solve them, like underwater radar or, laser weapons or what have you. There's a lot of like sci-fi stuff that you can come up with and, has the potential if you have like, what do people say? Like, the equivalent of like a 1,000 von Neumanns like running at like 1,000 hertz a second or something. Like you can imagine a world in which you come up with some pretty crazy shit that could give you a dramatic military advantage. But AI, you're right. AI is not there yet. But Dario believes that it might be there pretty soon. And I am I think it is, given the pace of advancement, it is not crazy to price that in as a double-digit possibility. Yep. And with that as your premise, then you got to take all this export control stuff really seriously.
That's right.
Which is sort of where I come out on the issue. But it is a bummer because I do think there are going to be global social costs to not having everyone and their mother being able to work on this stuff and pursue, all the upside it can bring. But hopefully we'll get there too.
Open source sort of makes that diffusion answer very easy to answer, which is that it will just be out there. And, the thing with open source is like, if you want to make money off of it, most of the times you don't even know who's using it. And if they don't tell you, right? And that's sort of the beauty and the curse of building open source software. And that's always been the case, and it always will be the case. And hopefully the benign version wins, but we shouldn't be complacent about the fact that the non-benign version could also end up being reality.
Kevin, we've done a lot of emergency pods over the years. I'm particularly proud of this one. I think it turned out really well. Thanks so much for being a part of ChinaTalk.
Absolutely. Thank you for having me back, and always happy to return to have these conversations.